Throughout this channel, we've had lots of different conversations about the nature of religion, humanity. In this video, for the first time, I will be presenting a scripted speech on what I believe the essence of atheism is in specific. So strap on as we go on this ride. Atheism and theism are in essence separated by empiricism and faith. Yet, in a situation of the presence of one and the absence of another, the present belief system constitutes only the status quo rather than the default natural worldview. Therefore, the view that the status of atheism is not a belief structures is flawed, as it commits the mistake of believing that empirical worldviews are the default state of man, and that religion is an invasive feature, an artificial addition of a kind. At least in the modern day, atheism etymologically is a negation of theism, and therefore cannot exist without the previous status quo being religious. Now, we've discussed this many times before in the Fundamentorum videos or the tolerance ones. Watch those videos to find out more. This, as can be noted with developments like pop music, is a concept of practice that can only exist in the negation or rebellion of an existing one, and therefore the death of the original is equivalent to the death of the said ideology. Yet, the empirical tradition demands that the beholder places empirical evidence and reasoning above all, and its successes in explaining the natural world leads those on to assume it has an omniscient worldview and is the best one. The same, of course, can be said of theism, which has had equal, if not greater, success in explaining the spiritual, a realm with no metaphysical distinction from physical reality. However, this development is no shock given the humanist developments and a greater self-consciousness of society in the modern day. But because post-Enlightenment Aristotelian thought has won over Platonic traditions of the spiritual and the immaterial, it serves as an almost obvious extension that empiricism takes over. This victory demands the reduction of the actual presence of the spiritual, because empiricism is a totalizing force. And once that process has completed, atheism takes root not because of its criticisms of the existence of God are valid, but because of the built-in assumptions brought upon society by the Aristotelian tradition and system of thought. In fact, the very question of the existence of God or a God is born from the very assumption that proof is necessary for anything. And therefore, atheism is not a negation of theism, but an admittance that empiricism is the status quo ideology. The real world faces consequences as a result of this variance, however. Institutions like the Catholic Church, despite being bastions of faith, grapple with the internal and external divisions caused by the presence of doubt. As has been defined before, living in the current global world order and modernity necessitates a base level of doubt, not in the validity of a divine order, but of the existence of it at all. That is to say, the question is not of is Christianity right or is Hinduism correct. The question is whether or not the idea of divinity and the idea of spirituality is real at all. To a certain degree, these institutions fail because it is difficult to capture the hearts of those who have been conditioned, and no fault of their own, of course, to question before believing. It was not originally the job of churches and major religious groups to be drowning in the sea of doubt, desperately trying to prove and answer questions regarding the existence of God. There was a time indeed in which the job of religious institutions was to interpret and support, and heretics were not celebrated but vanquished, and did not leave a trace behind. Any threat to social stability was taken care of swiftly, because degradation in social institutions was something that smaller societies could not tolerate. Even looking at dystopias like 1984, we saw that there was no winner. There was no victory by Winston. And this may seem like an anti-intellectual statement from me, which, of course, if this is your first video, is a fair assumption. But I am not calling for an abandonment of critical thinking and rigor. However, any reaction that you may have as such is simply an acknowledgement that the current baseline worldview is based on empiricism and that there is nothing to do to fight it. It seems, bar any large change in the way religious figures and educational systems operate, that atheism will slowly take over the vast majority of modern societies. There is no technical threat in this fact alone, and as noted before, it is simply a shifting of the status quo from religious to atheist. The danger in this is that the human condition and all major legal documents assume a moral framework not derived from laws to be instilled into the population. John Adams famously remarked that the Constitution was built for a moral and religious people. Yet, as mentioned previously, atheism is a belief purely based on being anti- or non-theist and has no basis in any movement. It chooses to accept or reject the previous status quo beliefs because that was the moral reality beforehand. It does not have a means of mandating direct moral standards past the banalities of utilitarianism because there's always a question of why something is being done. And there will be a point in time in the future, of which, of course, nobody knows for certain, where atheism will quote-unquote prevail over the so-called myths of theism, and will find itself in a peculiar position. That position will be one where it will need to start from scratch for how to base its laws and how to regulate its citizenry, not through laws. For atheism is currently a luxury belief one can hold in a theist society. As said before, atheism cannot exist in a vacuum. Once society becomes atheist due to complacency from theism, there can only be one end: the destruction of society's moral standards and development. This was already observed in multiple points in human history, all with varying standards of living. This isn't just a modernity issue. The end of the Imperial Rome, the Weimar Republic, and the West. In essence, the point being reached in this is that atheism is a belief structure indeed, but a belief structure inextricably tied to theist traditions in a way that restricts it from becoming a true replacement for theism. The constant bombardment of campaigning and messaging that morality is objective and that theism is oppressive will serve as the greatest flaw in the movement. As if and when the atheists take over the majority of society, it will be impossible to reconcile a consistent narrative which wished to run society. Now this isn't anything new, right? Even the French Revolution had severe, different types of opinions after the revolution happened. After all, if morals are objective, then there must be an objective way of empirically proving them to be so. Why is XYZ bad? Or why is XYZ good? And if the concession is made that morality is in fact subjective, then they must reconcile different coalitions which have different views of morality. Not every single person in the atheist pantheon agrees on what true objective morality is, and therefore each of them will bring their own subjective morality into the table. Decay is already undergoing this process on an individual and subnational level, but has yet to set in completely. However, as expressed earlier, there is no stopping this decay unless severe change is undertaken by the religious and educational figures in society. I fear that the most difficult part of this necessary yet unlikely backlash is the ability for those with below average introspection skills to realize how their beliefs are structured without going back to the empirical thought they were socialized to embody. This backlash would, I hope, not have the consequences of freezing societal growth. In fact, the main purpose of any sort of backwards quote-unquote change will be to reform and reconcile the benefits of empirical thought into a theist worldview, such that morality and behavior can be enforced while technical and scientific development can progress. Those two are not mutually exclusive. But so long as the scientific developments automatically cast doubt on the existence of divinity, rather than nurture it, this will be impossible. For even if those in the business of progress accept to lose their empirical worldview on spiritual matters, the results of studies will still speak for themselves, and doubt will bubble up once more. Thus, the project of reforming and ensuring the atheist movement does not rise is the assurance that the focus is not put on the separation of empiricism and faith, but of the physical and spiritual, and the suppression of any empiricist incursions onto spiritual matters. Once more, this distinction may seem arbitrary, but it really is the key of the whole issue. The fact that the spiritual world is regarded as incompatible with physical reality, when in fact it is simply another facet of it, from a tradition that should be extant but was largely dissolved. Yet it is difficult to break free from this default, ingrained style of thinking because it has largely been beaten into us by the world and the education systems, especially in the West. This change must be done on an individual level before it is expanded into an institutional and societal level change, because there is only damage to be done should this sort of change be mandated on any sort of people. But the road ahead is to be difficult, surely. Should any one person attempt to take on the difficult task of making change in this realm? It is easy to follow the beliefs you're born into. That is a fact. It is uncomfortable to let go of that and become atheist. It is hard to accept, once more, that religion is indeed an invaluable asset to society and to the individual. It is an astronomical task to regain faith that was once lost to empirical thought. The argument made is not to institute religious theocracy, nor is it a belittling of normal people. Instead, it is an observation of the status quo and the impending failure of the religious comeback alongside the impossibility of secular society. Thank you. So, yeah, quick little speech there. Yeah, let me know what you think. It was a bit wordy. Maybe not every term is strictly defined very well, but as always, rather reviewed. Leave your thoughts down below.